Opening background: the tragedy at the suburban home. It was a cold November evening in Greenfield, a small secluded town nestled in the misty hills of Oregon. The leaves had turned a crisp orange and crimson hue, carpeting the quiet streets that wound through rows of neatly kept houses, each standing as a testament to suburban serenity, but tonight, the calm was shattered. At dusk, Mrs. Jane Turner, a neighbor of the Hartfield family, stood at her kitchen window, peering across the dimly lit street. She couldn't shake the gnawing unease that had been building over the last 2 days. The sprawling white colonial-style house of the Hartfields had remained unnervingly dark. No lights, no movements, no sound of the family's Labrador, Max, barking at squirrels in the yard. "They haven't been out all day, Joshua," Jane said to her husband, her voice tinged with worry. "And Sarah hasn't answered my calls." Joshua, seated at the dining table tinkering with his old radio, glanced up. "Maybe they're out visiting relatives?" he suggested, though he wasn't entirely convinced. Jane shook her head. "Their cars are still in the driveway and the garbage cans are full. It's not like Sarah to just disappear. She'd say something." The next morning, when the mailman noticed the overflowing mailbox and the untouched stack of newspapers piling up, he grew concerned. Jane, along with a few other neighbors, gathered hesitantly at the Hartfield's front gate. Whispers of doubt turned into murmurs of alarm. "John always mowed the lawn on Saturdays," Mr. Perry from next door muttered as he gazed at the neglected front yard with remnants of last week's storm scattered across it. "I haven't seen him all week." The lingering sense of dread erupted into full-blown fear when someone noticed faint, rust-colored stains along the edge of the family's front porch. Determined to act, Jane finally dialed 911. "It's probably nothing," she told herself, but the quiver in her voice betrayed her true feelings. The local sheriff's department dispatched 2 deputies to check the scene. Deputy Mark Ryan, a seasoned officer in his 40s with a quiet, calm demeanor, and his rookie partner, Amy Collins, who had just joined the force earlier that year, pulled up at the Hartfield residence as curious neighbors gathered at a distance. "Looks quiet," Amy said, stepping out of the patrol car, her breath visible in the chilly morning air, but even she felt an underlying eeriness to the stillness. Mark adjusted his belt and climbed the front steps, his boots crunching against dried leaves scattered on the porch. He rapped on the door, no answer. When Amy circled the house and called out from the back door, the same silence greeted them. "Something's not right here," Mark muttered under his breath. They'd handled welfare checks before, but this one felt different. After receiving permission to enter the home, Mark gave the door a good shove and it creaked open slowly. The air inside was still, heavy, almost unnatural. As the 2 deputies stepped inside, the scent of decay hit them like a wave, the kind no police officer ever wants to encounter. The living room was eerily pristine, almost too clean. A coffee cup sat on the table, still half filled with cold coffee. A plate of uneaten cookies lay on the counter. The quiet hum of the fridge from the kitchen was the only sound breaking the silence. "Amy," Mark called out, his voice tense. "We need backup, now." Venturing further into the house, they noticed small signs of a struggle. A picture frame knocked askew on the wall, a set of car keys scattered on the floor near the entrance to the dining room. Then they saw it. Blood, smears of it on the hardwood floor, leading like a grisly path toward the stairs. It was no longer just a feeling of unease, it was real, it was tangible, and it was horrifying. By the time more officers, forensic teams, and detectives arrived, the grim discovery unfolded. 5 lifeless bodies were found sprawled throughout the house, each scene more chilling than the next. John and Sarah Hartfield were in the master bedroom, John with injuries that suggested he fought till his last breath, Sarah in a pool of dried blood near the dresser. Their 3 children, ages spanning from 16 to 25, were all found in separate rooms, each showing signs of a brutal attack. The final and most haunting discovery was made by the family's small backyard shed. Max, the family dog, lay lifeless near the door, as though he had been silenced for trying to protect his human family. And so began the greatest tragedy the town of Greenfield had ever seen. A quiet neighborhood transformed into the epicenter of horror. Police cordoned off the area, news vans arrived in droves, and rumors spread like wildfire. Was it a botched burglary, a revenge plot, or something even darker? Though the house now stood empty, it was anything but silent. The whispers of the deceased seemed to echo through its walls, begging for justice as investigators scrambled to piece together the fragments of a broken family and a shattered sense of peace in Greenfield. The victims identified, and early suspicions. By late afternoon, the coroner's van had pulled up to the Hartfield residence, along with a flurry of unmarked police cars and a forensics team. Inside the house, a grim discovery was unfolding one room at a time. 5 bodies, 5 members of the same family. For a town as small as Greenfield, with a population barely scratching 8,000, it was a tragedy that no one would have ever expected. Sheriff Alan Reed stood solemnly on the front lawn, his thumbs hooked into his belt. The weight of the situation was evident on his weathered face, a look of disbelief mixed with quiet determination. "Give me the rundown," he ordered, turning to Detective Rachel Hayes, one of his most experienced investigators. She clutched a clipboard, her gloved hands already spotted with dark smudges from evidence notes. 5 victims, she started, her voice tight. John Hartfield, 52, found upstairs in what we assume is the master bedroom, significant defensive wounds. Suggests he put up a hell of a fight. Rachel paused and glanced toward the window of the bedroom, visible even from where they stood. Sarah Hartfield, 48, found in the same room. It looks like she was attacked first. The sheriff frowned, looking past Rachel momentarily as more officers moved in and out of the house. "What about the kids?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Rachel shifted her weight uncomfortably. She was known for her professionalism under pressure, but even she couldn't mask the unease that clung to her demeanor. 3 of them, she said, drawing in a slow breath. Emma Hartfield, 16, found in what appears to be her bedroom on the upper floor. Single knife wound, fatal. Jason Hartfield, 23, in the downstairs study. There were signs of a struggle, overturned chairs, a broken lamp, and finally, Adam Hartfield, 25, in the guest room. His injuries, she hesitated, consistent with blunt force trauma, likely incapacitated quickly. The sheriff rubbed the back of his neck, letting the horrifying details settle in his mind. 5 lives wiped out in one night, the kind of scene that would replay in the nightmares of anyone who'd set foot in that house. "And the dog?" he asked quietly. Rachel looked down at her clipboard, almost reluctant to reply. "Max, the Labrador, found near the backyard shed. We believe the killer silenced him to prevent barking." The sheriff muttered a curse under his breath and shook his head. Jesus Christ. Who the hell does something like this in a place like Greenfield? By that evening, the stretch of street in front of Meadow Ridge Avenue had turned into its own crime scene. Yellow tape blocked off both ends, and curious neighbors huddled behind the barriers, hushed whispers rippling through the crowd. "I heard it's the whole Hartfield family," someone murmured near the edge of the crowd. "No way," another cut in. "I saw Sarah just a few days ago at the grocery store. She looked fine, happy even. Who could do this?" "Do you think it was some vagrant or a drifter?" an older man asked, puffing nervously on a cigarette despite the disapproving look from his wife. "I mean, this doesn't seem like your usual burglary gone wrong." Back inside the house, the buzz of the crime scene continued. Every detail of the spotless living room, the immaculate kitchen, and the eerily untouched dining table began to gnaw at the investigators. Nothing added up. Detective Hayes walked into the temporary command post set up in the Hartfield's driveway. Her hands were stuffed inside her coat pockets to stave off the chill that rolled in with the evening fog. "We've ruled out robbery," she stated plainly, catching Sheriff Reed's attention immediately. "What makes you so sure?" he asked, biting back the faint hope that maybe this wasn't as personal as it now seemed. Rachel crouched beside a plastic evidence bin containing random valuables that had been tagged from the home. "All the cash, jewelry, electronics, it's all here. Whoever did this wasn't here for money or goods." "Then what the hell was their motive?" Reed asked, exhaling wearily as he crossed his arms. In his decades-long career, he'd seen dozens of petty crimes and a handful of violent incidents, but never something this calculated, this personal. Rachel fixed him with a steady look. "Honestly, Sheriff, whoever this was, they wanted to wipe out the whole family. We're not looking for a random thief. This was deliberate." By midnight, leads began to trickle in as the investigative team pieced together who the Hartfields were. Or rather, who their family and acquaintances were. It became clear that the Hartfields were nothing short of the picture-perfect suburban family. John had been a respected local contractor, Sarah was a middle school teacher loved by her students, and their 3 children were accomplished in their own right. Emma was a straight-A student, Jason was pursuing an MBA, and Adam had recently started his first job at a marketing firm. But it was one name that started to shift the focus of the investigation. Madison Hartfield, the eldest child, who hadn't lived with the family for years. According to initial background checks, Madison had moved out to California after a falling out with her parents and had since been estranged from her siblings. Slightly estranged, but not eliminated from suspicion, Rachel noted, reviewing Madison's file as she sat across from the sheriff in the command post. "You think she did this?" Reed asked, leaning back in his chair. His brow furrowed as he considered the theory. "She'd have to be a real piece of work to not just kill her parents, but her siblings too." Rachel didn't answer right away. "I don't know if she did it, or she's connected to whoever did. But there are reports of consistent discord between her and her father, particularly about her choice of partner, a guy named Kevin Richards. Background isn't pretty. Arrested multiple times for assault and domestic disturbances." Reed straightened up immediately at the name. "Kevin Richards? Is he still in the picture?" "That's unclear," Rachel admitted. "Madison's current location is still being verified, but Richards' last known address was in Nevada, and he's off the radar." She pushed a photograph of a burly man in his early 30s across the desk toward Reed. "We're running checks, but if this guy resurfaced near Greenfield..." Reed finished the thought for her, his voice dark. "Then this wasn't just a murder, it was personal." Rachel nodded. "Everything about this feels personal." Reed rubbed his temples, trying to piece together the fragments of a motive. Whatever drove someone to annihilate the Hartfield family ran deeper than greed. It reeked of anger, of buried resentment, of hatred, and those kinds of emotions always left a trail. "Find Madison," the sheriff ordered, "and find Kevin Richards. He might not be here, but I want every damn resource we've got looking into him." Rachel nodded and reached for the communication device clipped to her jacket. "Already on it," she said, stepping out into the chilly night. The lights of the Hartfield house flickered faintly behind her, casting long shadows on the deserted street. Somewhere in Greenfield, or far beyond it, a killer was watching, waiting, and perhaps planning their next move. The eldest daughter's mysterious disappearance. It was well past midnight when Detective Rachel Hayes sat down again at the command post, rubbing her temples and staring at the open file in front of her. Madison Hartfield's face looked back at her from a decades-old high school photo, a younger, carefree version of the woman who now seemed to have vanished into thin air. There was something about the picture-perfect smile, a thinness to it, an almost forced cheerfulness. Rachel couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't just about a missing daughter. "What do we know about Madison?" Sheriff Alan Reed asked, stepping into the command post, the lines of fatigue drawn across his face as the fluorescent light highlighted dark circles under his eyes. Rachel glanced up from the file. "Not enough," she admitted, her voice heavy. She tapped a pen against the table as she reeled off the basics. Madison Hartfield, 27 years old, the oldest of four, moved to California nearly 6 years ago after a major falling out with the family. She's estranged from her parents, and apparently her siblings too. Neighbors say she rarely visited, if ever. Reed folded his arms, leaning against the edge of a table covered in maps, mugshots, and coffee-stained documents. Estranged but not forgotten, what's her story? Rachel flipped through the notes as she continued. She was known as the black sheep of the family. A bit of a rebel in her younger days. Skipped college after a year, worked odd jobs, drifted between cities. The Hartfields didn't exactly approve of the people she hung with. Especially one guy in particular, Kevin Richards. "Richards," Reed repeated, his voice tinged with annoyance. "The boyfriend with the rap sheet." "Exactly," Rachel confirmed, pulling a mugshot of Kevin Richards from the pile on her desk. A stocky man with a hard jawline and eyes that betrayed a lifetime of anger. Assault, battery, domestic disputes. We're talking fights with bar patrons, scuffles with neighbors, even a few run-ins with police over disturbances in public places. Not exactly the guy you want your daughter dating. Reed narrowed his eyes, leaning in to scrutinize the mugshot. This guy was trouble waiting to happen. When was the last time anyone saw Madison? That's the thing, Rachel said, exhaling sharply and flipping through more pages. No one seems to know. According to her last known address, she'd been living out of a rented apartment in Oakland, working sporadically at a diner. Her landlord hasn't seen her in months. There's one report from about 4 months back, something about a noise complaint at her apartment involving Richards, but he's off the radar and the trail's gone ice cold. Reed let out a low whistle, pacing the room as he processed the information. You think he's involved in this? Because if Madison's been missing for months, he gestured toward the crime scene on the other side of the street, then this thing just got a hell of a lot more complicated. Rachel nodded grimly. Her being missing is troubling, and then there's the timing. Her family gets wiped out just days after she's already AWOL. I don't believe in coincidences, Sheriff. Reed ran a hand through his graying hair. All right, walk me through the family dynamic again. Why was she estranged? She butted heads with her dad a lot. From what I've gathered, John Hartfield was, well, a man of traditional values. Hard work, discipline. Madison didn't exactly fit that mold. She dropped out of school, stayed out late, ran with the wrong crowd, and then came Kevin, Rachel said, holding up Kevin's mugshot again. The wedge between her and her family only grew deeper. There were shouting matches, accusations, slammed doors. Eventually Madison left, and it doesn't sound like she looked back. Reed stared at the photo of Madison again, his jaw tightening. So what's the angle here? Did Madison get herself into trouble and someone decided to send a message? Or, he said, his tone darkening, did she bring trouble home with her? I'm leaning toward the latter, Rachel admitted, pulling up more notes on a nearby laptop. If we can track down Kevin Richards, we might get some leads on Madison's whereabouts. Right now, we've got nothing but dead ends. Records show he cleared out of his last known job in Reno almost a year ago. And the neighbors, the family friends? Did anyone see her or hear from her lately? Reed pressed. Nothing, Rachel said, shaking her head. No phone calls reported, no social media activity. Even her bank account hasn't been touched in months, not since her rent was last paid. Weird thing is, her landlord said a woman, matching her general description, showed up to collect her security deposit about 2 weeks ago. Reed raised an eyebrow. 2 weeks. Do we know for sure it was Madison? Rachel hesitated. No ID was given. The landlord said she looked like her but couldn't say for certain. She claimed she was leaving town. Heading somewhere in the Midwest, that's all we've got. That's not enough, Reed growled. It doesn't explain why her entire family ends up slaughtered. And if she's dead, like you suspect, where the hell is her body? Rachel fell silent for a moment, staring at the evidence board pinned to the far wall. It was covered in photographs, sticky notes, red strings connecting timelines and locations, or at least their best guesses of where Madison's life had led her. Every thread led back to one person, Kevin Richards. What if we're looking at this wrong? Rachel finally said, her voice quiet but resolute. What do you mean? Reed asked, brow furrowed. What if she didn't leave on her own? What if Kevin took her? Rachel tapped the timeline in frustration. If her family hated him, that's a motive. If they drove him or Madison out of town, it's another motive. And if Kevin's been following her, keeping tabs on her, controlling her, what are the odds he didn't take her when things went south? And if he did? Reed leaned in, his voice low. Then why kill the family? That's the question, isn't it? Rachel said darkly. Either Kevin is cleaning up loose ends or someone who has ties to Madison and knows what happened is finishing unfinished business. As Rachel and Reed sat in heavy silence, the shadow of Madison Hartfield loomed large over them. Somewhere out there she was either a key witness, a victim, or an accomplice. And until they found her, or her trail, they'd be left chasing whispers and ghosts. The type of questions no one wanted to ask began creeping into the back of their minds. Was Madison's disappearance the spark that ignited a brutal massacre? Or was she an unwilling pawn in a game of revenge they were only beginning to understand? Clues from the crime scene detective Rachel Hayes stood in the Hartfield backyard, staring down at the faint tire tracks etched into the dirt, barely illuminated by the soft beam of her flashlight. The air was dense with tension and the faint metallic tang of iron. It had only been 48 hours since the gruesome discovery, but every inch of this property seemed to breathe with the secrets of that night. Somewhere in this chaos there was a trail to follow, if only they could piece it all together. Rachel! Sheriff Alan Reed's voice interrupted her focus as he approached from the back porch. His boots made a dull thud against the wooden planks, his flashlight aimed at a dark, ambiguous stain on the ground. Forensics just sent over the initial report. We need to talk. Well, talk, Sheriff, Rachel replied, keeping her gaze fixed on the ground. Because right now, the only thing screaming at me is that this killer knew exactly what they were doing. Reed handed her the clipboard containing the report. Ran preliminary tests on those stains at the base of the porch. It's blood, but not just from one person. Mixed profiles. The way it's pooled suggests someone was either dragged or stood bleeding profusely here for a while. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Dragged or waiting? Waiting, Reed agreed grimly. If I had to guess, it looks like whoever did this subdued their victims and then brought them here, one by one, before moving things out to the backyard. Rachel frowned deeply, her eyes scanning the neatly trimmed hedges and the patch of disturbed dirt near the edge of the yard. It was a chilling thought, imagining the Hartfields, one by one, taken from the comfort of their home in the dead of night. There's more, Reed continued, his voice lower now. Forensics found what appears to be fiber fragments, rope fibers specifically. Some were embedded in the wood railing, suggesting the killer tied at least one of the victims here, maybe multiple. Rachel let out a long breath, her mind racing with possibilities. So, they were restrained, silent. Whoever this was, Reed, it wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thing. This was planned, controlled. Across the yard, a forensic tech wearing a headlamp waved at Rachel. "Detective Hayes, you're gonna want to see this." She exchanged a quick glance with Reed before making her way over. A small patch of muddy earth near the tool shed had been sectioned off, with gossamer-thin yellow crime tape fluttering in the cold breeze. The tech pointed to a fragment of steel, wedged deep into the dirt. Rachel crouched down, her gloved fingers hovering over the object. "What am I looking at here?" she asked, pulling a small penlight from her jacket and illuminating the jagged edges of the fragment. "Blade," the tech said simply. "Broken off, probably from a combat or survival knife. It's got traces of blood along the edge, but we'll need the lab to confirm if it matches the victims." Reed crouched beside her, his brow furrowing as he studied the broken blade. "You're telling me this thing snapped during the attack?" "Looks like it," the tech replied. "Judging by the depth it was buried, someone either slammed it into the dirt while panicking or it broke during a struggle and they tossed it here." Rachel stood, wiping her gloves clean on her pants. "A broken blade! That changes the picture, doesn't it? Means the killer may have had to adapt," she said, her tone distant as though she were speaking more to herself than to Reed. "If the knife broke, what did they use afterward? Their hands? Another weapon stashed nearby? Either way it means they faltered briefly, just briefly. But not enough for anyone to get out alive," Reed added darkly. The investigation moved to the front yard as another tech flagged them down. Near the driveway, deep grooves were barely visible in the dirt, cutting through the thin layer of fallen leaves. Rachel folded her arms, her eyes scanning the soft ground. "Tire marks," she noted. Her fingers tapped the side of her flashlight rhythmically, a signal that her brain was working at hyper speed. "Judging by the width, I'd say it's from a pickup truck or a full-size SUV. What do you think?" Reed squatted near the tracks for a better look, running the beam of his flashlight along the parallel grooves. "Definitely a heavier vehicle," he agreed. "Maybe an older model too. Newer ones don't leave this kind of imprint unless the ground's really soft." Rachel's expression hardened. "So, we're looking at someone who either owned or had access to a truck. What do you bet they used it to transport something, or someone, away from here?" "As in the bodies," Reed replied grimly. Rachel nodded, her jaw clenched. She turned on her heel and walked back toward the house, her mind already piecing together what evidence they had. Inside, another layer of the killer's methodical approach came into focus. The dining room table had been set, almost mockingly, for dinner. 2 plates, partially filled with food, sat undisturbed, except for one fork which lay beneath the table, as if it had been knocked down during a sudden movement. "This is unsettling," Rachel murmured, taking in the scene. "It's too clean, don't you think? Almost staged?" "It screams control," Reed replied firmly. "One plate here hasn't even been touched. Someone sat down to eat or was interrupted before they could." Rachel nodded, her gaze moving to the wineglass beside the untouched plate. A single fingerprint, blurred but visible, pressed against the glass. "If this doesn't belong to the family," she said, pointing to the print, "then we may just have our killer's signature right here." The late afternoon cast long, eerie shadows over the house as Rachel and Reed returned to the driveway, each grappling with their own suspicions. All the pieces seemed like fragments of a cruel puzzle, the type where precision and malice lurked behind every detail. "They restrained them!" Reed broke the silence, his voice contemplative. "They killed them one by one. It had to be quick, clean." Rachel exhaled, her breath visible in the chilly air. "There's no sign of forced entry. Either the killer had a key, or the family let them in willingly. Which means," Reed started, but Rachel finished his sentence for him. "It's personal. Whoever did this knew the Hartfields. We just need to figure out how well." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Rachel stood alone at the edge of the yard, staring down at the abandoned tracks. Somewhere out there, she thought, the killer was retracing their steps, watching, or waiting for the gears of justice to catch up. But as methodical and precise as the killer had been, they had left traces behind, and Rachel intended to find every single one of them, broadening the investigation. Detective Rachel Hayes leaned over the whiteboard plastered with photos, timelines, and stacks of sticky notes, her fingers gripping a dry erase marker as she sketched an expanding set of circles. One by one, she scribbled names, relationships, and potential leads, all stemming from the center, the Hartfield family. To the side, Sheriff Alan Reed watched with crossed arms, his expression unreadable, bathed in the glow of the fluorescent workshop lights of their makeshift command post. "All right," Rachel began, using the marker to circle Madison Hartfield's name and draw a thick arrow pointing to a mugshot taped beside it. "We know this guy, Kevin Richards, was a major point of tension in Madison's life and by extension the entire Hartfield family. By all accounts, they couldn't stand him. We've confirmed he has a history of violent behavior and based on our timing, he's priority number one to track down." "Sure," Reed said, his voice low and gravelly. "But here's what's bothering me. Assuming our boy Kevin is involved, what's his motive? Is it about Madison, the family, both, or—" His voice trailed off for a moment. "Was Madison just his excuse to come back here and settle a bigger grudge?" Rachel sighed, staring at Kevin's mugshot. His square jawline and the perpetual scowl in his eyes told a story of anger barely contained, an internal fight always threatening to spill out. "From what we've pieced together so far, Sheriff, everyone in this damn family had a reason not to trust Kevin. It's no secret he and Madison had a volatile relationship. Domestic disturbances, neighbor complaints, cops called on more than one occasion. Hell, her landlord out in Oakland said he'd seen Kevin hanging around the unit even after Madison had moved out." Reed frowned, tapping his pen against a copy of Kevin's prior arrests. "But Madison's been missing for months, Rachel, found dead 10 miles from here. Kevin didn't stick around Oakland, so why now? Why come here and wipe out her whole family?" Rachel straightened up and tapped the board with the butt of her marker. "That's the thing. We don't have a timeline that makes sense yet. Either something set Kevin off recently, a message from Madison's family, a confrontation we don't know about, or—" She hesitated. "Or what?" Reed pressed. "Or he's not working alone," Rachel finished. "This crime, it's too meticulous. We're talking deliberate restraint, no major evidence left behind, multiple weapons used, a vehicle to cleanly transport the bodies post-mortem. I don't know, Sheriff. If this was just Kevin, then he's leveled up." Reed's gaze hardened. "He's capable of worse than we've seen. Let's focus on him for now. What did you get about his movements?" Rachel grabbed a stack of reports fresh off the printer, flipping through them as she spoke. "Kevin's been off the radar officially since last year, right after his last parole meeting in Reno, but—" And this is where things start to get interesting. The bar fight brawl from 6 months ago in Wyoming? The description matches Kevin. Same build, same tattoos on his forearm. Cops managed to get him on camera fleeing the scene, but he was gone by the time they followed up. "So," Reed said, nodding slowly, "he doesn't just disappear, he adapts." "Exactly. The guy's been taking cash gigs, construction work, odd jobs, and staying below the radar while moving state to state. He's been in Oregon in the past 6 weeks, no question about it. He didn't just show up in Greenfield by coincidence." Rachel tossed the reports onto the table. "He's winding his way back home." Reed stepped closer to the board, studying Kevin's poorly lit mugshot as if the man would suddenly give up his secrets. "And now we've got a family wiped out and another murder in Madison. So where's his base? Where's he squatting?" The investigative team was expanding their search radius, poring over leads as evidence filtered in from nearby counties. Officers had started knocking door to door around Greenfield, questioning any locals who may have seen unfamiliar vehicles, faces, or behaviors on the night of the murder. By early afternoon, Detective Hayes got a call from Sergeant Finn Parker at the district outpost 40 miles upstate. "We got a potential sighting," Parker said through static. "Couple in Clackamas County reported a guy pounding on their door 2 nights ago, asking to use their phone. Claimed his truck broke down on Route 76. They turned him away, but they swore he had a knife strapped to his hip, made them nervous." "Description match Kevin Richards?" Hayes leaned forward in her chair, already flipping to the map stretched across her desk. "Matches perfectly," Parker replied. "Mid-30s, rough-looking, dark scruff on his face. He left after a minute, but here's the kicker. Our team just found a wrecked truck in that area. Abandoned." Rachel closed her eyes, her frustration mounting. "And let me guess. No registration?" "Not in his name." Parker paused. "It's scratched out. No plates either. But there's blood in the bed of the truck we're sending to the lab." "Damn it," Rachel muttered, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Okay, keep me posted. Get someone combing the surrounding area. I'll coordinate with you once we ID the blood." Late in the evening, Reed circled the names sprawled on the board again, his pen hovering over Madison Hartfield for an elongated pause. "Rachel," he said quietly, looking over his shoulder. She glanced up from her laptop. "Yeah?" "Let's not rule out Madison brought Kevin into this. I don't care about the estranged sibling storyline. If she called him, contacted him, or let him know about a fight with her family, It's all tied up in motive. Either they fought before she disappeared or he perceived something in her absence as her abandoning him. Rachel nodded, leaning her elbows onto the desk. It's possible, but... She tapped her fingers along the edges of a case photo. Something still feels... off. She gestured at his pen. What if Kevin didn't choose this family? Reed raised an eyebrow. You think someone else hired him? Not hired him, manipulated him, Rachel said. I don't know, but from the control at the scene, I just can't shake the feeling there's somebody smarter involved, someone capable of orchestrating revenge as efficiently as this. Reed's eyes darkened as he stepped back and gazed at the board once again. What they faced wasn't just brutality, it was something colder, more deliberate. All right, the sheriff finally said, decisive. Keep the team leaning on Kevin's associates, bank accounts, calls, anyone we haven't cross-referenced. If there's another actor in play, they won't stay hidden forever. As the investigation widened, the edges of the story blurred. A volatile, missing man with rage coursing through his veins, a daughter who vanished and triggered a chain of violence, and unseen shadows pulling the strings that no one had yet uncovered. The search area was vast. Every new lead expanded the possibilities. Somewhere in the neighboring counties, or far beyond, a trail was waiting to be found. And both Rachel and Reed knew they had to find it before whoever was responsible struck again. The discovery of a woman's body. 3 days after the Hartfield murders brought Greenfield into the national spotlight, another development shifted the investigation into uncharted territory. Somewhere deep in the wooded expanse of Pinecrest National Forest, around 20 miles east of the Hartfield home, an early morning trail runner stumbled upon a grim discovery. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm voice broke through the line as the man's panicked breath came in sharp bursts. There's a body in the woods, the caller stammered, his voice trembling with shock. It's a woman, she's just lying here, she's not moving. Sheriff Alan Reed and Detective Rachel Hayes had barely settled into their routine briefing at the command post when the call came in. Get your coat, Reed said, snatching his car keys off the desk. There wasn't a sliver of hesitation in his voice. 20 miles out, we've got to see this ourselves. An hour later, the two of them were weaving through the narrow, damp trails of Pinecrest, accompanied by a swarm of forensic techs, deputies, and state troopers. The October morning had left the earth damp, the air filled with a scent of pine and decay. It was eerily silent, save for the crunch of boots and the occasional radio chatter. We're getting close, Rachel said, glancing down at the coordinates pinned on her tablet. Witness called it in about a quarter mile from here, said he found her off the trail, partially hidden by a pile of leaves. She's not going to be hidden for long, Reed muttered, adjusting his belt as if preparing for what they were about to see. What do we know about the area? Hikers? Campers? Rachel shrugged, keeping her eyes ahead. It's remote, sure, but locals use these trails a lot. We'll need to talk to every park ranger and trail regular in a 20-mile radius. A body showing up here isn't just random. It wasn't long before they reached the crime scene. A somber hush fell over the group as the body came into view. The woman lay eerily still, her body partially buried in the damp earth beneath a layer of decomposing leaves. Her hair, tangled and matted, spilled across her pale face, and her clothes, casual jeans and a sweater, were soaked through from the rain that had passed overnight. A faint trail of dried blood ran down one side of her neck where the gash in her skin told an unmistakable story. The scene spoke volumes. She had been dumped, discarded like an afterthought in the quiet woods, but she hadn't simply stumbled here on her own. Rachel knelt beside the body, her gloved hands hovering just above the edge of the sweater. She's been here a while, she murmured. Her eyes traced the jagged wound along the victim's throat. But not days, judging by decomposition I'd say, 12 hours, 15? Fits the timeline, Reed replied, standing close, his arms crossed against the chill. If she was killed the same night as the Hartfields, Rachel bit her lip. The thought hung between them unspoken but understood. We need an ID, she finally said. Could this tie back to Madison? An ID came quickly. The woman was Madison Hartfield. The revelation hit like a sucker punch. Jesus, Rachel whispered as one of the deputies handed her the victim's ID wrapped in an evidence bag. She stared down at the laminated license, her eyes locking onto the picture of Madison's smiling, youthful face. It barely resembled the lifeless form crumpled before her. It's her, it's Madison. The weight of the moment settled heavily over the small crowd of investigators. Reed exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. So, she didn't vanish into thin air, and she wasn't running, she was running out of time. Back at the command post, later that afternoon, Rachel stood before the updated whiteboard, staring at Madison's picture now pinned alongside the images of her family's crime scene. A deep, undeniable pit was forming in her stomach. She was gone before her family was even... Rachel paused, staring at Reed, who was standing next to her, sipping coffee and studying the evidence wall with a scowl. Why kill her first? Why stage her out here miles away and then go after the rest of the family? Reed shook his head slowly, tossing his empty coffee cup into the trash. Could have been a message. We just don't know who's sending what. Rachel tapped her pen against the edge of the whiteboard. Look at the control, though. Madison isn't just a loose end. She's the key here. Whatever led to this, whatever pushed someone to tear apart this family, it started with her. Reed leaned against the edge of the table, letting her words sink in. After a beat, he gestured toward Madison's timeline. She's not clean in this, he said darkly. Listen, I'm not saying she deserved what she got, but estranged daughter, volatile relationships, running with the wrong people. Kevin Richards doesn't exactly scream stable. Someone wanted her silenced, Rachel. They had to. You don't slit someone's throat and dump them in the woods unless they're part of something bigger. Rachel frowned. So what? Kevin killed her here and then snapped, went back to the house and took out the whole family in some kind of grief-fueled rage? Maybe, Reed muttered. Or maybe someone else did. Someone cleaning up after Kevin, or using him. The autopsy report from the medical examiner came in the next morning, adding more fuel to the fire. Madison had been dead roughly 12 hours before her family's massacre, matching Rachel's earlier estimate. The cause of death was, as suspected, exsanguination from the deep wound to her neck. But there was one chilling addition: ligature marks on her wrists. She was tied up, Rachel said bluntly, running her eyes over the report. This wasn't immediate. Someone held her somewhere before they killed her. Reed narrowed his eyes. Tortured? Possibly, Rachel said, closing the folder with a sharp snap. Or just delayed. Either way, she knew it was coming. By late evening, the board in the command post was reshuffled yet again. Madison, once just a missing person of interest, was now firmly at the center of the case. Her role was undeniable, but the question of why remained elusive. Think about it, Rachel said, almost talking to herself as much as Reed. What could she have known? What was so important it got her killed first and her family wiped out hours later? Reed sighed, glancing at his own notes. Information probably, something she held over someone's head. I don't buy that Kevin Richards acted alone in this. You don't execute a full-scale bloodbath like this without help or direction. Rachel's face tightened as she scanned Madison's picture again. Somewhere out there, another piece of the puzzle was waiting. Another motive, another name, another lead. And it was just a matter of time before the cracks in Kevin Richards' world began widening. Identifying the prime suspect, the ex-boyfriend. By the fourth day of the investigation, the Hartfield massacre had gripped the entire town of Greenfield. News vans lined the streets, reporters and cameras hovering just beyond the police cordon with questions swirling: who could be responsible for such a horrific crime? As rumors flew like wildfire, the investigating team in their crowded makeshift command post started to zero in on one name: Kevin Richards, Madison Hartfield's ex-boyfriend. The moment Kevin's name had first surfaced as part of Madison's troubled past, something about him struck a chord with Detective Rachel Hayes. This guy isn't just a piece of Madison's story, she said to Sheriff Reed during one of their many late-night case breakdowns. He's a linchpin. Every trail we follow seems to circle back to him. Reed leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. The dim fluorescent lights of the command post made his gray hair look almost white. You're not wrong. Kevin's got a rap sheet about a mile long: assaults, domestic disputes. He's a textbook time bomb, he muttered, tapping his pen against his notepad. The problem is, Rachel, a gut feeling won't get us a warrant. We need hard proof, something that puts him in Greenfield the night these murders happened. Rachel turned back to the growing evidence board. A pixelated photo of Kevin Richards loomed at the center of the cluster of names, timelines, and red string connecting pieces of evidence. Beside it was a copy of his criminal record, a grim roster of arrests that painted the picture of a man prone to explosive violence. What do we know about his last movements? Reed asked, leaning forward. His voice carried an edge of urgency, the weight of the case pressing heavier with each passing day. Rachel flipped through her notes. Last confirmed sighting of Kevin was 8 months ago in Reno, she began. He'd been taking cash jobs, construction sites mostly, keeping off the grid as much as possible. After that he vanished. No digital trail, no credit card transactions, no fixed address. But, she paused, pointing to a new report that had just come in, Things started to heat up again 7 weeks ago when he was spotted in Oregon. Reed furrowed his brow. Spotted or guessed? Spotted, Rachel confirmed, flipping to a witness statement. Bar fight outside of a roadhouse near Ashland. Bouncer clocked him as mid-30s, stocky build, tattoos, matching Kevin's description. He didn't stick around though, bolted before the cops could get there. Reed let out a low whistle. And here we are weeks later, he's back in the area. Coincidence? No chance. Through relentless digging, ties between Kevin and Madison's demise grew tighter. Neighbors from her last known address in Oakland reported seeing Kevin around her apartment, even after their supposed breakup. One neighbor described heated arguments between the two that often ended with Kevin pounding on her door well past midnight. He hounded her, Rachel said during the morning briefing with the investigative team. Kevin's the kind of guy who doesn't let go. This was more than just a bad breakup, it was an obsession. And an obsession always leads somewhere dark, Reed remarked. Then came the break they were waiting for. A witness had come forward from a gas station off Route 76, just 12 miles from Pinecrest National Forest. The clerk remembered a man who looked like Kevin pulling up in a beat-up pickup truck late in the evening of the murders. He bought 2 gallons of gas, paid cash, and acted nervous, sweating despite the cold October night. 2 gallons of gas? Rachel had asked when she heard the report. That doesn't make sense for a trip. He wasn't just topping off. For 2 gallons, that's almost deliberate. Like maybe he had planned to burn something. You're thinking Madison's body, Reed replied grimly. It fits, Rachel said, setting the clerk's statement next to the growing pile of circumstantial evidence. We find Kevin. I guarantee his truck ties him to Pinecrest. As the search for Kevin intensified, the tone in the command post grew more pointed. Every lead narrowed the field, painting a picture of a man driven by anger and a need for control. Witnesses in Greenfield began to come forward, stating they'd seen someone fitting Kevin's description lingering near the Hartfield home days before the murders. Creepy guy by the hedges, one neighbor described him in vivid detail. I thought he was some landscaper or delivery driver, but now, I'm not so sure. Another local mentioned spotting an unfamiliar truck parked at a trailhead just outside of town the night before the murders. Didn't think much of it until I heard about the killings, they said. The guy in the truck, he never got out, just sat there, watched. Rachel's pen etched furiously across her notebook as Reed took down a coffee-stained map of Greenfield, marking every sighting of Kevin or a matching vehicle, connecting the dots. It's him, Reed said with conviction. All paths lead to this bastard. But the most damning evidence came when forensics returned the preliminary results from the abandoned truck found near Route 76. The bed of the truck had faint traces of blood, Madison's blood, confirmed by the lab. Rachel didn't celebrate the discovery. The confirmation felt hollow, a reality too grim to find satisfaction in. It puts him in Pinecrest, she muttered eventually. And it puts Madison in his truck. What about her family? Reed asked, his frown deepening. If he killed Madison first, what took him back to the Hartfield home? Revenge? Maybe, Rachel answered, staring off into the whiteboard. Or guilt, or some twisted sense of finishing what he thought they started. By nightfall, Kevin Richards was officially declared the prime suspect, with an APB issued across state lines. Photos were released publicly, detailing his last known description: 5'11", stocky, with a dark beard, visible tattoos on his forearms, and an angry temper that erupted at anything that challenged his control. You think he knows we're coming for him? Reed asked as the team organized a coordinated effort to track down Kevin. He's too paranoid not to know, Rachel replied, a grim determination settling over her features. But he won't just run. Guys like him think they can outlast everyone else. And that's where they're wrong, Reed muttered. Outside, the cool October wind whipped through the parking lot, carrying the weight of the investigation as the team moved into action. Somewhere out there, Kevin Richards was either running, hiding, or waiting for his next move. But with the walls closing in, he was running out of time, and the detectives knew it was only a matter of when, not if, they'd catch up to him. The hunt for the killer. The manhunt for Kevin Richards began the moment his name was declared as a prime suspect. But catching him was proving to be a monumental challenge. By all accounts, Kevin was no stranger to life on the run. He was a survivor, a man who had spent decades honing the skills needed to stay hidden. He knew how to live off the grid, avoid modern conveniences, and, most importantly, maintain distance from law enforcement. For Detective Rachel Hayes and Sheriff Alan Reed, every hour Kevin remained at large was another opportunity for him to slip away. The first sighting. It was the 6th day of the investigation when the first solid lead came in. skirts of Camas County, Idaho, phoned in a tip after spotting a man matching Kevin's description camping near an abandoned barn. "I swear it was him, Sheriff," the farmer said over the phone, his voice laced with unease. "He looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days, and, he had a knife on his belt, big one." The tip set the team into motion. Rachel and Reed worked with state police to coordinate a search in the remote regions near the barn, but by the time they arrived, Kevin had already vanished. All they found were the remnants of a small campfire, cigarette butts, and a stash of canned food stolen from a nearby house. Rachel muttered, pacing the perimeter of the barn as the wind whipped her coat. Her eyes scanned the tree line as if she could catch a glimpse of him in the shadows. "He's smart enough not to stay in one place, but he's sloppy. Look at this." She crouched near the fire pit and pointed to a partially burned pack of cigarettes. Reed frowned as he knelt beside her. "Bringing anything flammable into the woods with him? Yeah, sloppy. Overconfident." "This might help us," Rachel said, holding up the discarded cigarette pack. "If he's leaving clues, then he's starting to lose his edge." Kevin leaves a trail. Over the next few days, Kevin's actions grew bolder and more erratic. Reports trickled in from rural towns and highway truck stops. County claimed he'd seen a man fitting Kevin's description purchase a can of gas and an old hunting map. That same night, deputies in the neighboring county responded to a break-in at a general store. The painkillers and a flashlight. "He's scavenging now," Reed said during a late-night strategy session at the command post. The map of the region was spread out on a table in front of them, littered with red potential movements. "This is survival behavior. He's low on supplies, probably hungry, and he's on foot. That means he's got to be close." Rachel nodded, staring at the map with a furrowed brow. "He's moving using trails, avoiding open roads. If we can predict his route, we could cut him off." "Maybe," Reed replied, crossing his arms. "But he's not behaving like a man running just to survive. He's got a goal." Sharply. "You think he's heading somewhere?" "Or someone," Reed said darkly. "A dangerous encounter." The next major break came from a backpacker just outside the town of Cascade. Ghost, the young man arrived at the local sheriff's office claiming he had been robbed at knife point while hiking a remote trail. "He came out of nowhere," the hiker stammered, gripping his cup of coffee with trembling hands. "One minute I'm setting up camp, and the next he's standing there with a knife. Said he needed my rations and my water filter. Took everything and disappeared into the trees." Rachel and Reed arrived at the station within 2 hours of the report. The hiker's description matched Kevin perfectly, right down to the worn leather boots and tattooed arms. "This guy's spiraling," Rachel said, gripping the bridge of her nose. "He's not just surviving anymore, he's completely unstable." Reed exhaled heavily, and unstable men with nothing to lose are the most dangerous. The team mobilized immediately, combing the dense forest with search dogs and aerial drones. The dense undergrowth and rugged terrain made the search painstakingly slow, but one discovery gave them a sliver of hope: a bloodied bandana, picked up by one of the tracking dogs near a rocky outcrop. "He's injured," Rachel said quietly, examining the fabric. "Either from a fall, or he ran into someone tougher than him." "Good," Reed replied, his voice cold. "Let's hope it slows him down." Closing in. By the 10th day, the manhunt had spread across 3 states. Kevin was being tracked not just by local authorities but by federal agents brought in to support the operation. Roadblocks were set up on highways and trailheads were monitored around the clock, but Kevin still managed to stay one step ahead. It was becoming increasingly clear to Rachel and Reed that Kevin knew this terrain like the back of his hand. "Why the hell is he staying out here?" Rachel asked one night, slamming her coffee cup onto the table as she pored over the map yet again. "If I were him, I'd head for a city, hide in the chaos." Reed leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Because cities don't give him the control he wants. Out here, he's in command, the trees hide him, the people do his work for him like that hiker." Rachel shook her head. "He's a damn ghost." "Ghosts slip up," Reed reminded her, "and this one's leaving a trail we can follow. It's only a matter of time." The final push. The breakthrough came on the 11th day when a hunter stumbled upon what he thought was an abandoned cabin, deep in the Sawtooth Range. He entered cautiously but retreated almost immediately after noticing food wrappers, a tattered map, and what he described as a knife jammed into the table. The information sent chills through the team. Kevin had been holed up in the cabin, possibly regrouping or planning his next move. A team of officers, including Rachel and Reed, descended on the site with everything they had. As they surrounded the cabin, the night air was heavy with silence, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant cry of an owl. The scene was tense, every officer with their weapon drawn, every shadow a potential threat. "Kevin Richards!" Reed's voice boomed through the loudspeaker, echoing through the forest. "We know you're in there! Step out with your hands where we can see them!" For several agonizing moments there was no sound, no movement. Then, a faint creak as the cabin door opened slightly. Kevin emerged slowly, his face gaunt and shadowed, his eyes wild and sunken. A knife gleamed in his right hand. "Gun on the ground now!" Rachel yelled, her voice firm, unwavering. "Don't make this worse, Kevin." Kevin smirked, bloodshot eyes scanning the officers as though weighing his options. "You think you know everything, don't you?" His voice was hoarse, broken. He took a single step forward, the knife still in his hand. The next 30 seconds were chaos. Kevin lunged suddenly, his knife raised, not at the officers, but at himself. It took 3 officers, including Reed, to wrestle him to the ground, disarming him in the struggle. When the dust settled, Kevin lay on the ground, restrained, bloodied, but alive. "Should have let me finish," Kevin muttered, a dark grin spreading across his face. "Not a chance," Rachel replied coldly, standing over him. "You're not walking out of this one." As Kevin was dragged away in cuffs, Rachel and Reed exchanged a glance. The hunt was over, but the answers were just beginning. Somewhere in Kevin's fractured mind lay the truth about why Madison and the Hartfield family had to die, and Rachel was determined to pull that truth out of him, no matter how long it took. Tracking Kevin's movements. Even with the manhunt in full swing, Kevin Richards seemed to remain one step ahead of law enforcement. For days it felt like every lead ended just as it began, leaving Detective Rachel Hayes and Sheriff Alan Reed chasing shadows. Kevin wasn't someone who made many alliances. He'd learned to live off the grid, relying on his own resourcefulness to stay invisible. But no man could truly hide forever, and it wasn't long before cracks in Kevin's facade began to surface. Early tip, an argument in public. The first significant clue came in from a waitress at a truck stop diner just outside Boise, Idaho. She called in after seeing Kevin's mugshot in a news segment. "Yeah, it was him," the waitress confirmed when Rachel and Reed followed up with her later that day. She leaned against the counter of the dingy diner, arms crossed, her voice brimming with certainty. "Came in 2 nights ago with this young woman. Pretty girl, but, she didn't look too happy." Rachel's pen froze mid-note. "He was with someone? That's new." "Uh-huh," the waitress said, chewing her gum nonchalantly. "Sat right back there in the corner booth. Ordered 2 coffees, just black, but here's the thing. He started raising his voice at her. She was crying, hands fidgeting with her sleeves, you know? Didn't hear much except something about nobody walking out on him." Reed's frown deepened. "He left with her?" The waitress nodded. "Yeah, left cash on the table and stormed out with her tagging behind like she didn't really have a choice." As they walked out of the diner, Reed lit a cigarette, the thought gnawing at him. "Who is she?" he muttered. "That," Rachel answered, slipping into the passenger seat of their cruiser, "is the million-dollar question." Kevin's name surfaces again. Just days after the truck stop report, another call came in from a motel owner near Jerome, Idaho, claiming a man and a young woman matching Kevin and his mysterious companion's descriptions had checked in the night before. "It's funny," the motel owner said, scratching at his stubbly chin when Rachel and Reed questioned him. "Guy didn't say much, paid cash, insisted on it actually. The girl stayed in the car while he came in to grab the key. Didn't even look at me when I handed it to him." Rachel flipped her notebook open. "How long did they stay?" The owner shrugged. "Checked out first thing just after sunrise. Didn't even bother leaving the key. Just drove off like something lit a fire under his ass." "Did they leave anything behind?" Reed asked, his voice sharp, willing an edge of hope into the dead-end chaos they'd been chasing. "Nothing big," the man replied. "Just some garbage." He led them to the dumpster in the parking lot, swiping open the lid with a grunt. Among the beer cans and fast food wrappers, Rachel's eye caught a crumpled map, stained with what looked like sweat and coffee. She pulled it free with her gloved hands, carefully smoothing it out. "Look at this," she murmured, holding the map up to Reed. Several routes crisscrossing rural Idaho were highlighted in pen. One stretch of highway, Route 95, was circled multiple times with heavy red ink. "He's planning something," Reed muttered, "or heading somewhere." An aggressive encounter. The trail took another turn when a hiker near Riggins, Idaho, reported being confronted by a man fitting Kevin's description. This wasn't just an odd sighting. This time Kevin's desperation had begun to boil over. He came out of nowhere, the hiker explained later to Rachel and Reed, still shaken hours after filing his statement at the local police station. Pulled a blade on me, big one. Asked for my food, my water, anything I had, but he didn't just ask. He said something like, "You want to walk out of here, don't you?" Rachel's fingers tightened around the edge of her notebook at the hiker's words. There it was again, Kevin's control, his need to dominate every situation. "What happened next?" Reed asked quietly. "I gave him what I had," the hiker replied, his face pale. "I wasn't about to argue with a guy holding a knife. He grabbed my pack and disappeared into the woods. I didn't stick around to see where he was going." "Smart move," Rachel said, though her mind was racing. The image of Kevin out there, drifting from town to trail, growing more volatile with every passing day, left a bitter taste in her mouth. The companion mystery deepens. In each of the sightings, Kevin wasn't alone. The detail about a young woman was a detail Rachel couldn't shake. "This girl," Reed muttered later as they sat in their makeshift command post, staring at the map of Idaho marked with pins and red string. "She's got to be tied to this somehow. He's not the type to trust anyone, let alone bring someone along." Rachel nodded, staring at her notes. "It doesn't make sense, does it? He's a loner by nature, paranoid. Odds are she's not with him by choice." "Hostage?" Reed suggested. "Maybe," Rachel murmured. "Or maybe something deeper. If she's scared, crying, like the waitress said, there's leverage Kevin's holding over her." A silence settled over them as the weight of that realization sank in. A final break. The discovery of Kevin's companion raised as many questions as it answered, but a major break came when yet another sighting was reported, this time in the small farming town of New Meadows. A local repair shop owner claimed a man fitting Kevin's description had come in looking for help with a busted radiator. "What'd he drive?" Rachel asked the mechanic as Reed scribbled notes on a pad beside her. "Older truck, beat to hell," the man replied. "Guy didn't say much, just kept tapping his fingers on the counter like he was impatient or something, kept looking over his shoulder too. Real nervous." "Did you fix it?" Reed asked. The mechanic shook his head. "Didn't have the part in stock." He hesitated before adding, "But there's more. Saw someone in the truck cab while he was pacing around waiting. Couldn't tell much from the distance, but whoever it was didn't get out." Rachel's lips tightened into a thin line. "The girl." "Probably," the mechanic replied. Piecing together Kevin's path. By late evening, the string of reports painted a clearer picture of Kevin's movements. He wasn't heading aimlessly. Each sighting drew the investigation team closer to Route 95, toward the isolated mountain paths outside McCall, Idaho. It became clear Kevin had a destination in mind, one Rachel could only guess at. "What's in those woods?" she asked aloud, standing over the evidence board with her arms crossed. Reed stared at the map, his jaw set. "Either someone or something he doesn't want us to find." Rachel's gaze intensified. "We need to figure it out before he disappears again. Or worse, before someone else gets hurt." Kevin's movements were no longer the aimless actions of a man simply trying to stay hidden. As the law closed in, it became painfully clear that Kevin was playing out something deeper, a plan that no one fully understood yet. Rachel knew they were running out of time to stop him, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the girl with him, whoever she was, might hold the key. The tense standoff with police. After nearly 2 exhausting weeks of tracking Kevin Richards across state lines, it all came to a head deep in the Sawtooth Range. The remote wilderness had proven to be Kevin's most dangerous ally. Dense forests, rocky cliffs, and winding trails offered him camouflage and a labyrinth few outsiders could navigate. But with each step, he grew sloppier, hungrier, and more desperate. And now, everything had narrowed to an abandoned hunting cabin perched on the edge of a ridge, its faint chimney smoke betraying the fugitive's hiding spot. Detective Rachel Hayes arrived at the scene with Sheriff Alan Reed just after dusk, the sun painting the sky in ominous shades of red and gray. From their SUVs parked along the narrow dirt road, they could see a faint orange glow coming from one of the cabin windows. "He's in there," Reed muttered, adjusting his belt as he studied the structure through binoculars. "Looks like he's settling in for the night." Rachel clicked the safety off on her sidearm, her jaw tightening. "Or planning his next move. You think the girl's still with him?" "Hard to tell from here, but I'd bet she is," Reed said. "Guys like Kevin don't just pick up hostages for no reason. If she wasn't useful, she wouldn't be alive." Rachel swallowed hard and glanced at the tactical team assembling behind them. Officers in tactical gear were loading rifles, checking scopes, and slipping bulletproof vests over their jackets. The air was heavy with tension, every breath thick with anticipation. I'm still not convinced he goes quietly, Rachel said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Oh, he won't, Reed replied darkly. He's a fighter. You don't survive this long just to turn yourself in when the law finally corners you. He straightened up, his voice low but firm. Which is why we end this fast. Setting the trap. From their position, Rachel and Reed coordinated the setup. Officers moved silently through the woods, circling the cabin in calculated movements. Floodlights had been hauled up the hill and placed strategically along the perimeter, ready to bathe the scene in light the moment Kevin stepped into view. Once the lights are on him, there's nowhere to run, Rachel said quietly, tracing her finger across the tactical map as she spoke to the lead officer. Encircle him and block off both the cabin's front and back exits. We don't need him slipping into the woods again. Reed nodded, gesturing to the deputy handling the loudspeaker. Let's start with some good old-fashioned negotiation. If Kevin's smart, he'll know his options are down to two. Surrender or... He didn't finish, but the implication hung in the air. Rachel glanced at the cabin one last time and sighed softly. Let's just hope the girl's still alive in there. The standoff begins. The first announcement echoed through the woods like a thunderclap, shattering the eerie silence. Kevin Richards, this is Sheriff Alan Reed. We know you're in there. Step outside with your hands in the air and no one gets hurt. The cabin remained silent. Rachel could feel the tension thickening like a storm cloud as her eyes fixated on the front door. It had the creaky, weather-worn look of something that had been slammed too many times and yet it didn't move. No shadow passed the windows. No sound came from inside. Reed repeated the command. Kevin Richards, we are giving you one chance to surrender peacefully. Come out now, unarmed, and this ends tonight. This time there was movement, a faint shuffle, the sound of a chair scraping against floorboards. Rachel stiffened, her hand resting on the grip of her gun, her breath shallow but steady. Then the door creaked open slightly. For a moment nothing happened. Then Kevin emerged slowly, his face gaunt and shadowed, his eyes wild with fatigue and fury. In his right hand, a knife gleamed dully in the faint light of the fire behind him. The first words. Drop the weapon, Kevin, Rachel called out, her voice firm, cutting through the crisp night air. We've got you surrounded. Kevin ignored her, his lips curling into a thin, mocking smile. You think cornering me's gonna solve your little puzzle, huh? He murmured, just loud enough to be heard. He took a single step forward, the knife still held tightly in his grip. You think you figured me out? Reed stepped forward now, his large frame cutting a commanding presence as he leveled his gun. This isn't a negotiation, Kevin. Drop the knife, now! Kevin let out a low, bitter chuckle, his gaze darting between the officers. None of you get it, do you? You think you're the heroes of this story. Rachel's heart pounded as she raised her voice. We're not playing games. Drop the knife before this goes sideways. For a moment, it looked like Kevin might actually listen. He flicked his wrist casually, letting the blade catch the light. Then his smirk faded, replaced by a dark, hollow expression. No one's walking out of here clean, he rasped, his voice suddenly cold. Chaos erupts. Before anyone could process his words, Kevin moved. In a heartbeat, he lunged, not toward the officers, but back toward the cabin door, slamming it shut behind him. Reed bellowed orders and the tactical team sprang into action. Breaching now! One of the officers shouted as several men rushed the cabin. A battering ram splintered the door into pieces, and the floodlights exploded to life, bathing the entire scene in blinding white. Shouts filled the air as officers poured inside with weapons drawn. Rachel and Reed followed closely, their guns trained on the chaos unfolding in front of them. Inside, Kevin had taken the girl. Rachel now saw her clearly for the first time, a frightened young woman, her face pale and tear-streaked, no more than 21 years old. He held the knife near her neck, his body crouched behind her like a shield. Nobody moves! Kevin snarled, his voice ragged and desperate. I swear to God, I'll do it! Rachel's breath caught, her mind racing with calculations. Kevin, listen to me, she said, her voice steady but calm. This doesn't have to end like this. Put the knife down, let her go, and we'll talk. She's not going anywhere, Kevin spat. His grip tightened on the girl as he dragged her back toward a shattered window. If I'm going down, I'm taking someone with me. The final moments. Reed's patience snapped. Kevin, don't do this, he barked, his gun locked on the fugitive. You don't get to make the rules here. Rachel took a step forward, her hands trembling slightly, as she kept her Glock aimed squarely at Kevin's chest. Let her go, Kevin. You want this to end with any shred of dignity? You let her go. Kevin froze for a fraction of a second. His eyes met Rachel's, and for the first time there was something other than fury in them. Doubt, hesitation, Then, just as he shifted his weight, an officer lurking by the side of the room tackled Kevin from behind. The knife clattered to the ground as the girl broke free, sobbing and running toward Rachel's outstretched arms. Kevin thrashed beneath the weight of 3 officers, shouting curses until his voice cracked. Within seconds he was cuffed, his face pressed into the dirt. "You think this is over?" he sneered, breathing heavily as he was dragged to his feet. His wild eyes darted toward Rachel, his voice curling with venom. "You'll never know why." "Oh, we'll find out," Rachel muttered, her voice low and steely. "Starting with you." As Kevin was hauled away into the night, Rachel exchanged a weary but relieved glance with Reed. The girl had been saved, the hunt was over, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that Kevin's final words had buried something darker just beneath the surface. The killer's shocking confession. The interrogation room was cold and sterile, the kind of place designed to strip someone of all pretense. The walls were bare, a single overhead light casting sharp beams down onto the steel table in front of Kevin Richards. His wrists were cuffed, secured tightly to the bolted rings on the surface, but he held an air of defiance nonetheless. His face was bruised from the struggle during his arrest, a line of dried blood cutting diagonally across his cheek, yet his dark eyes burned with something primal, anger, control, or perhaps satisfaction. Detective Rachel Hayes sat directly across from him while Sheriff Alan Reed leaned against the wall, arms folded as he watched every twitch of Kevin's movements. The door behind them stood shut, the sounds of the busy precinct muffled to near silence. It was just the 3 of them, and the ghosts of the Hartfield family lingering somewhere in that heavy, suffocating room. Rachel slid a manila folder across the table, its edges sharp against the dim light. "You know why you're here, Kevin," she said, her voice steady but sharp as a blade. Kevin let out a low chuckle, leaning back in his chair until the cuffs rattled against the steel. "Oh, you dragged me out of that cabin because you think I'm your bad guy. That it?" "You are the bad guy," Rachel shot back, her calm cracking slightly. "We've got you. We've got Madison's blood in your truck, witnesses who've seen you stalking the Hartfields. Hell, we've got your own words from days of rage and violence leading up to this." Kevin tilted his head slightly, his grin widening. "You think splashing blood on a truck locks me in? Cute. You think walking into my shitty hunting cabin and putting cuffs on me solves all your little mysteries?" He leaned forward now, his face leveling with Rachel's. "You don't know a damn thing." Reed straightened from the wall at that, walking forward and slapping his palm down hard on the table. The room vibrated with sudden energy, but Kevin didn't flinch. "We know you killed Madison," Reed growled. "We know you killed her family. If you've got some big dramatic reason why, now's the time to spit it out." Kevin's grin faded. His pupils, fierce and dark, flitted to Reed, then back to Rachel. "You think killing Madison was about her?" His voice was soft now, dangerously low. "She betrayed me. She ran. She left me with nothing, and no one does that to me." Rachel's pen stopped mid-air, her grip tightening instinctively. She leaned in closer, her gaze narrowing. "What does that mean, Kevin? She betrayed you? Ran where?" "She thought she could go home," Kevin spat, his jaw tightening. "Thought she could dump me and go hug Daddy and Mommy and pretend she was their sweet, perfect little girl again. But you know what? You can't just waltz back into the fairy tale." His voice hissed between his teeth, the venom in his words palpable. Rachel pressed further. "So you followed her to Greenfield. You followed her to her parents' house. What, Kevin? You wanted revenge? To drag her back?" Kevin leaned back again, the chair's metal legs creaking under his weight as he let out a harsh laugh. "Revenge? Drag her back?" He shook his head. "It wasn't about dragging her back. It was about proving she never should have left in the first place." Reed scoffed, his face twisting with barely contained disgust. "So what? You think killing her was gonna prove something? Sounds like the rant of a coward who didn't get his way." The grin vanished from Kevin's face, replaced by a cold fury that spread like frost. "You don't get it, old man. You think I rolled into that town just to put my knife to her throat? Yeah, I killed her. Yeah, I made her understand. But it was when I stood there, looking down at her lifeless body in those woods, that I realized it wasn't enough." The room seemed to shrink as Kevin's words hung in the air. Rachel's stomach churned, but her voice was steady when she asked, "So you went after the Hartfields?" "Damn right I did," Kevin sneered, leaning forward now, his tone menacingly quiet but eerily calm. "They're the ones who poisoned her. They turned her against me. They made her think she was too good for me, planting all these little ideas in her pretty little head about what life should be like." He gestured at the air with his cuffed hands, casting an invisible film of mockery. "College this, career that, marriage to some shiny goddamn prince. But you know what none of them counted on? None of them counted on how far I'd go to make it all stop. Reed stood silent for a moment, then muttered under his breath, "Jesus Christ." Kevin smiled again, but this one was hollow, sinister. "You don't take something away from a man like me and get to sleep peacefully in your big colonial house with your perfect little family." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. "So what, Kevin? You think you showed them? You think walking into their home and butchering them makes you anything but a sad, hateful man? What was the point? What did you want?" "I wanted them to lose everything," he said, each word measured and sharp. "The way I lost everything. Madison was the tether keeping me sane. You cut the tether and all bets are off." He gave Rachel a long, pointed look. "Don't act like you don't know what that feels like, detective. Losing control." Rachel ignored the barb, though her heart pounded in her chest. She refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. "So, you're saying you killed John, Sarah, the kids, because they loved her? Because they wouldn't stand for what you put her through?" Kevin's head tilted, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "I didn't just kill them. I destroyed them. You should have seen John. Thought he could fight me off. Got a few good shots in, but in the end, all that respect, all that pride didn't mean shit. They all went out the same way. On their knees." Silence filled the room. Rachel's throat tightened as Kevin's utter lack of remorse spilled onto the table like tar, thick and toxic. For one horrifying second she saw it, the Hartfield's final minutes, the horrific control Kevin must have exerted over them. Reed broke the silence. His voice was dark, cold. "You're gonna rot for this." Kevin only smiled. "Let's hope the cell's better than that cabin." As the door slammed shut behind them, Rachel exhaled, fists clenched so tightly her palms ached. She made a quiet vow. This wasn't the last piece of horror Kevin would give up. If there were answers left buried in his darkness, she was going to find them. Closing the case, a tragic end. The courtroom was packed, rows of benches lined with reporters, locals, and family friends of the Hartfields, all there to witness the conclusion of the case that had haunted Greenfield for weeks. The air was heavy with quiet murmurs, the kind of sound that dissipates the second the judge takes the bench. Even the creak of old polished wooden pews felt accusatory, as though the room itself sought justice. Detective Rachel Hayes sat in the back corner, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Sheriff Alan Reed was beside her, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. They had both been pulled from the raw wilderness where the case began into this polished courtroom, but the weight of the investigation hadn't lifted. If anything, it lingered like smoke after a fire, acrid, choking, and impossible to escape. A soft knock of a gavel silenced the crowd as Judge Marla Wexler entered the room. The jury had deliberated for less than 2 hours, a record for a case of this magnitude. It spoke to the clarity of Kevin Richards' guilt, and yet, no one in the room felt satisfaction. The sentenced Kevin Richards was brought into the room, his hulking form in an orange jumpsuit that somehow still exuded menace. His wrists were shackled, but the slight smirk on his face was enough to unnerve even the most seasoned officer. He scanned the room as though savoring every set of eyes on him, as though he thrived on their hatred and disgust. "Arrogant son of a bitch," Reed muttered under his breath. Rachel didn't respond. Her eyes stayed fixed on the judge, forcing herself not to meet Kevin's gaze. "Mr. Richards," Judge Wexler began, her tone clipped and deliberate, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "You have been found guilty on all counts, 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of aggravated kidnapping, and a host of other charges that simply flesh out the atrocities you committed." The room was silent as she paused, her aged hands gripping the bench before her. "You've shown no remorse," she continued, her voice hardening. "No regret, no acknowledgement of the lives you've destroyed, not just the Hartfields but the fabric of this community and every soul touched by your actions." Kevin tilted his head slightly as if considering her words, then let out a faint, bitter chuckle. It infuriated Rachel, but she kept her face neutral. She wasn't going to let him see the fire burning in her chest. Judge Wexler ignored the laugh, gripping her gavel tightly. "Kevin Richards, it is the sentence of this court that you be remanded to the custody of the state, and that you shall face the justice of death by lethal injection. May your final days serve as a small measure of the suffering you've caused." The room exhaled as one, a collective release of tension they hadn't realized they'd been holding. Reed leaned closer to Rachel, his voice low. "It's not enough." "It never is," Rachel whispered back. A town in mourning. After the verdict, the town of Greenfield tried to move on, but moving on wasn't the same as healing. The Hartfield house remained silent, a looming monument to the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. Rumors swirled of an interested buyer, Others claimed it should be torn down. To many, it was easier to imagine erasing the house entirely than facing what happened there. Rachel visited the site one last time before the city put up its "for sale" sign. The November air was cold, biting at her skin as she stepped onto the overgrown lawn. Yellow police tape fluttered in the distance, like a ghost unwilling to let go. "It's eerie, isn't it?" Reed's voice startled her as he walked up behind her, his boots crunching on the frosted grass. "Yeah," Rachel admitted, shoving her hands into her pockets. She exhaled, her breath a visible cloud in the cold air. "Can't walk by without hearing their screams in my head." Reed nodded quietly, his expression somber. "Places like this, they don't just fade away. They swallow you whole if you let them." Rachel stared up at the shuttered windows. For a moment she imagined the laughter of the Hartfield kids, the faint bark of Max, their beloved dog, who'd given his life trying to protect them. The house shouldn't have been a crime scene. It should have been a place full of life, warmth, and family. "Do you think justice matters in the end?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Reed looked at her, his grizzled face etched with sadness. "We caught the guy, didn't we?" "Yeah, but," Rachel hesitated, "even with this verdict, with Kevin rotting on death row, it doesn't change anything for the Hartfields. They're gone, Reed, all of them. Nothing we do brings them back." "No," Reed said simply, "but it keeps him from hurting anyone else." Rachel nodded slowly, knowing he was right but feeling the hollowness of that truth. "It doesn't feel like enough, though." "Does it ever feel like enough?" "Never has," Reed admitted. "But it's all we've got." The ripple effect. On what would have been Emma Hartfield's 17th birthday, the town held a candlelight vigil. Hundreds of people, classmates, neighbors, strangers who had only heard about the murders, gathered in the town square beneath the towering oak tree, its branches bare but lit with soft string lights. Photos of the Hartfield family stood on a makeshift memorial surrounded by hundreds of candles flickering in the biting wind. Rachel stood at the back, clutching a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She didn't plan to speak, but when a silence lingered after several community members shared their memories of the family, she took an uncertain step forward. When she reached the center of the vigil, she stared at the photos for a second too long. Sarah Hartfield's warm smile, John's protective stance with his children, and little Emma's joyful grin, all innocent, none deserving of their fate. She cleared her throat, the crowd silent as they waited. "I didn't know the Hartfields the way many of you did," she began. "But in my work, I learned who they were, loving parents, brilliant kids, a family who should have had everything ahead of them." Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to continue. "What happened to them wasn't fair, it wasn't right, and I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life. But what I want all of you to remember is the love they had for each other, and how this town, a town that's shown so much strength in the face of this tragedy, can carry that love forward." As she stepped back, the crowd erupted into quiet applause. Reed met her at the edge of the square, his hands shoved in his coat pockets. "Not bad for someone who hates public speaking," he teased lightly. Rachel huffed out a small laugh. "Don't get used to it." Looking ahead. Weeks later, Rachel sat in her office staring at Kevin's file, now closed in every official sense. Yet her mind kept circling back to his final words in the interrogation room. "You'll never know why." She hated that he might have been right. She hated that, even knowing every twisted piece of his logic, there would always be a jagged edge to this case, something left unresolved, no matter how hard she tried to tie the threads together. But she also knew that wasn't the point. Justice was never about perfection. It was about the attempt, the pursuit, the belief that even in a broken system, there could still be meaning. As she closed the file and turned off her desk lamp, she let out a long breath. Greenfield might never forget the Hartfields, and neither would she, because cases like this didn't just end, they followed you, settling deep in your soul as both burden and reminder. "Good night," she murmured to an empty room, though in her heart, she was saying it to the family she couldn't save, and with that, she walked into the cold night, the stars distant and faint in the inky black sky, a silent witness to it all.